good morning, or where I am sitting in the UK, it's good afternoon. And I'm going to apologize for looking a little relaxed and being in a t-shirt, but today it's 34 degrees where I'm sitting, and that is a record June temperature for this part of England. And that's some indication, I think, of what we need to be worried about when it comes to climate change. Thank you so much for asking me to come here. I'm just about to go and work out, if only I could see, because I just lost the control, to share my screen. And let me just do a slideshow, which should now go from the start. Hey ho, look, there you are. That's what we're talking about this morning. That's what I've been asked to talk about today. And we're having another session on tax later on as well. Tax and modern monetary theory. Now, I think this is an issue which has been too little explored to date. Tax is a passion of mine, as I think you'll have discovered in the next 45 minutes. And I want to introduce to you how I view tax within the context of MMT, of which I'm an advocate, but where I don't always agree with every proponent of the subject, as some people know, but I think a little diversity of opinion is always good for debate. The objectives of this talk, let's be clear what I'm trying to achieve this morning, because it's early and breakfast probably isn't long ago for many of you. So let's just be quite certain what I'm going to be talking about. I want to increase the understanding of the role of tax and MMT. As I say, I think too little understood and needing a greater focus. I'm not criticizing, by the way, anyone when I say that. We've all been through the struggle of explaining what MMT is. We've all received the brickbats, the abuse and everything else. So the fact that this dimension has not come to the fore as yet isn't a criticism to anybody. It's just something I think we now need to look at as we go forward in greater depth. I want to understand the role that tax can play within macroeconomic management when liberated from the tax and spend role. We all know, everybody who's, I'm sure, now in the room that I can see, knows that this is not what MMT is about. We don't tax and spend, we spend and tax. And as I will explain during the course of the talk, with my colleague Andrew Baker, who's Professor of Politics at Sheffield University, and one of the reasons why I'm there is to work with Andrew and other colleagues in their political economy unit, although I'm a professor of accounting. What Andrew and I talk about is tax as a withdrawal function and how that withdrawal impacts the economy. Of course, the spend is government created money. Most especially, I want to understand how tax, how MMT lets tax play a particularly new role in shaping the society for which a government is responsible. I wrote a book a few years ago. I'm looking for a copy. I will hold it up to the screen in case you can see the screen. If you can't, it was called The Joy of Tax. It hasn't sold as well as The Deficit Myth, but for a book on tax, it's done pretty well. It's something like 15,000 copies. So I was fairly pleased with that. It's pretty accessible. It embraces MMT. And the whole logic of The Joy of Tax was to say that tax is, well, actually, apart from money creation and the way it spends money into the economy, tax is the most powerful instrument that a government has got to shape the society for which it's responsible. And I see tax and MMT, the ability to create money, to spend, as being the flip sides of a coin. So together, they create the macroeconomic tools that we have to manage the economy in a very real sense, in my opinion. And as a consequence, the management of tax in an MMT economy is pretty critical. Those are what I'm going to be talking about. I did suggest some background papers for those who are wanting to take this issue further. I could have suggested more, but I'm pretty realistic. The world is finite, time is short, and these are not immensely challenging papers, I think it's fair to say. I don't write immensely challenging papers. I suspect it's also fair to say my critics would certainly agree. But the first of those is, I think, quite a significant paper. I think Randy said it probably was when it first came out. It came out in Real World Economic Review, which did a whole dedicated issue to MMT. and I was invited to make a contribution. And I know some of the other people who've been speaking this week did as well as critics. And I discussed tax and MMT. Some of that thinking I will be discussing this morning with you. So I won't go into detail on what the paper says, but quite a lot of the backup is in there. That idea then developed further in the paper I wrote with Andrew Baker for Social Policy and Society, which is a Cambridge University Press journal here in the UK, published here in the UK by the Social Policy Institute, which is a group of academics looking at social policy, fundamentally sociologists. So this actually expands MMT, discussion of tax, outside, if you like, the normal range of those who might be discussing the issue. But that to me is pretty important, and I think again a signifier of what I think the discussion of tax and MMT lets us do, because it moves us out of the silo of just being within a discussion around money and economics, but actually discussing social policy. The paper won an award, so I was quite pleased with that. I didn't get too excited by a £100 book token, but you know, these things matter when you're an academic, I guess. And we put a lot of effort into this, and it explored how some of the policies that I will be discussing later in this presentation can be put into practice, in this case, in a particularly UK context. But you know, the UK context is pretty much transferable, particularly to the US in many ways in this case. The last one is quite different, and it will be of interest to those who are interested in how MMT can begin to inform a more practical policy debate and reach beyond academia. It's a paper published by the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, or GIFT for short. Most of you won't have heard of GIFT. It's based in Washington, DC. It is funded very largely by the IMF and World Bank. It seems to work more closely with the World Bank than the IMF. The OECD also play a role. And the intention is to create budget transparency. They focused originally on the spend side of the budget, and they've done a lot of work around that. As a consequence, principles created by GIFT are now the UN standard for budget transparency around the world. GIFT is now looking to create a revenue side budget transparency standard, which it hopes will end up going in the same direction. And the thinking that Andrew Baker and I had done on MMT and the role of tax in society has very much informed this work we've done for GIFT. So we are trying to push, again, ideas that are MMT based around MMT and tax into a much wider network here, which, I mean, you may not be interested in that. If you want to look at practical application of ideas, this is a direction of travel. And it was presented as in the UK as part of the Research Excellency Framework, which those familiar with the UK academic world know that happens once every 7 years, in which universities get very excited and very stressed about. Selected academics have their work presented because it's considered good enough, and then it's ranked, and universities' funding, research funding, is largely based upon the outcome. Well, I know full well that the department that this was presented with got a pretty good overall ranking. You're never told your own personal ranking, but I know I got a decent one at the very least, because everything that the department submitted, we got a decent one. So that got some useful impact. Let's move on to the detail. Enough of that background and introduction. I'm told that you all understand the basics of MMT, so I'm not going to be discussing those. That's my assumption. I'm going to throw straight away out this accounting identity, with which I hope you are familiar, that government expenditure equals tax revenues plus the change in borrowing. Although I personally don't like the term borrowing, I would call it the change in government deposit taking, because I don't think governments do borrow, and I suspect there's a lot of you will have sympathy with that idea, but they do definitely take deposits from savers. The change in the amount of government money created plus A. Now, A is unusual in this equation. I've actually never seen it or anybody else put it in there, but I don't think it changes the identity. But as I've just been saying, I've been working with the GIFT Coalition, And the Gift Coalition is focused very heavily on developing country tax transparency. We're working particularly with South Africa and the Philippines at the moment, but are also having discussions in Latin America with a number of countries about this program. And aid can be a factor, and therefore I have thrown aid in. It doesn't, of course, change the actual fact that this is an identity. The reality is it doesn't change very much at all, but I threw it in for completeness. Now, what we know from that identity, which I don't think, frankly, anyone serious really challenges anymore. Plenty of people who would talk nonsense might, but serious economists, I think, have difficulty challenging that identity. We know that tax isn't necessary for government to spend. Simple, straightforward fact that it's obvious if you've got that many variables in the equation, it cannot be necessary for governments to have tax to spend. And yet what we also know, and we do know this, is that macroeconomically responsible governments have to tax to control the consequences of their spending, or else they will end up with an inflationary environment which is out of control. The paradox is that we don't have to tax, but the reality is we need to. And this is the paradox that we need to resolve about MMT and tax. Why tax? Well, in that book I mentioned, The Joy of Tax, I came up with 6 reasons to tax. They all, you will notice, have an R starting the second letter or second word in each of those paragraphs, because that sort of helps me remember that there are 6 R's, and therefore I actually remember what they are. It's always, otherwise always embarrassing. I suspect you've all made a presentation where you can say there are 6 reasons and you can't remember the 6th. Well, there they are. I think that this is reasonably complete. You could argue, about changes around it, but this is a pretty complete explanation, as far as I'm concerned, as to why we would want to tax. The first one is straightforward MMT. Again, you'll be familiar with this. This is to ratify the value of the currency. The tax paying tax gives the currency value. A standard MMT argument demanding payment of tax in the currency means it has to be used for transactions in a jurisdiction. It forces the currency into use. And I think that's a particularly important idea, and one which, from my experience, lots of people have difficulty getting their heads around when they first come across MMT. So we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it a lot. This stuff is always about repetition. Secondly, again, pretty standard MMT, we need to reclaim the money the government has spent into the economy. I throw in fulfillment of its democratic mandate, because I would rather hope that that does exist. And I think that chucking in political economy phrases is quite important when we talk about MMT, to make clear that this isn't just about a technical subject, it's about something much more than that. The next 4 are basically issues that I was very familiar with when I was in the tax justice movement. I co-founded the Tax Justice Network in 2003 and created other tax justice organizations. I'm now not a member of any of them, because there isn't a single tax justice organization that I know that will endorse MMT, because they are all desperate to believe that tax is what pays for government spending. We have a serious problem as a result, and I've ended up outside the movement, as has John Christensen, who was my co-founder of the Tax Justice Network. It's quite interesting that the 2 people who really set the thing going have both been basically excommunicated, because we both understand that tax is not the beast that, frankly, I thought it was in 2003. But to redistribute income and wealth, obvious standard social policy issue, reprice goods and services. We all know about market failure. We all know that tax is able to address market failure. I'll skip to the 6th one next, to reorganize the economy. This is fiscal policy, of course, the industries that you wish to promote, the activities that you wish to discourage, and you can obviously use tax as a reason to do both of those by providing subsidies or removing them. This is where the Green New Deal, which I co-authored in 2008, interfaces with MMT and the tax system, of course. And then we come to that 5th one, to raise democratic representation. This is based particularly on the work of a scholar, Professor Mick Moore, who's based at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex here in the UK. Looking at developing countries, there is a very clear correlation, it would seem, between those countries who ask for significant, i.e. noticeable amounts of direct taxation from their populations and the degree of engagement that population has with the democratic process. Indirect tax does not create that relationship at all, and it has to be a charge on people. It can't be a charge on corporations. But when there is a significant tax, then unsurprisingly, people are interested or more interested in what their governments are up to. As it was once said by an advisor to Bill Clinton, it all comes down to the economy is stupid. Well, no, it doesn't. Actually, it all comes down to tax when it comes to voting. Well, not quite, but certainly it has an influence. And I think my point is important here, that we can't pick and choose and say one of those is dominant over another. Each has a role to play. You have to think about them as a set of tools. This isn't like, going out to play a round of golf and saying you can do the whole thing with a sand wedge, which would maybe what you'd be trying to do if you tried, argument number 5. You need a driver, you need a putter, you need a wood. I'm not a great golfer, but I know those many. And it is the combination that is important here. So that's why we tax. Now, how to think about this? I think that MMT is intensely liberating about the way in which we really do think about government and how it can meet need in a way that, when I first came across it I sort of arrived at it really. In fact, when I was writing The Joy of Tax, I sort of arrived at it and then realized, hey, this whole bunch of scholars who I didn't really know much about were sort of in pretty much the same place, and I began to reconcile what I was thinking with what I was reading. And many of those will be around this conference, I'm sure. But it really makes it possible to think about tax in a very different way. And it thinks about the whole management of the economy in a different way. But what it says to me is that the focus that we've got within MMT, which has largely been around spend, is only half of the way the government can deliver its policy objectives. Because what is taxed at what rate, when, with what plan, consequence, clearly has a massive impact upon the way in which the economy is structured as well. And my suggestion is that we need to integrate this thinking into MMT. Just pursuing these ideas a bit further, very clearly we know that as such, tax is not just about raising money. Clearly, we do want a quantum of money. And there's no doubt that if there was to be a federal exchequer secretary, a UK chancellor of the exchequer who thought in MMT terms, and let's bring that on as soon as possible, inside the overall level of thinking that we would have within the macroeconomic framework, there would be an imagination as to what the figure for T might be within their budget equation. But T for tax is not what I would argue is the residual in that identity that I've already talked about. I certainly don't think it's aid. It certainly won't be in developing countries. It won't be actually in almost any country. I don't think it's tax, and I certainly don't think it's deposit taking, because frankly, that's take it or leave it. As we know, we don't have to borrow. We don't have to take deposits as a government to be able to spend. That's completely ludicrous. That's a consequence of spending. That's not a necessary condition for spending. So it can't be B. Therefore, actually, money creation is, of course, the residual in this equation. But again, that's important because it breaks this link between tax and revenue and the idea, which has been so commonplace within so much tax literature in economics in particular for so long, most of which I frankly find pretty irrelevant and pretty illiterate, if I'm honest, about what an efficient tax might be. Revenue generating capacity is not the criteria for appraising the desirability of a tax, I would therefore suggest. Simply not there because MMT doesn't require it and there are other things to issue. I'll develop that theme a little bit more, so I'll come back to that. So what are the criteria for selecting the tax base? Or simply, the government has to set out its objectives. This, by the way, is one of the things that we talk about a great deal in that GIFT publication. We talk about the need for a government to actually be explicit about what its taxation policy is, why it's raising certain taxes, what the goal is meant to be, what the expected outcome is. And very few governments are very good at this. Very few governments are good at tax reporting at all, by the way. And this is really quite important when we're considering tax inside the macroeconomic environment, because all it's thought of is as a technical little sideline issue where to raise some money, but it isn't. The social consequences, of course, are there. So there is a very inadequate narrative in most countries about what are the government's goals for taxation. But we can impute, even from existing systems, that there must be objectives. You know, why do we have what we hope to be overall progressive tax systems, although, let's be honest, there isn't much evidence that we're very good at reaching that outcome. In the UK, at least, the bottom 10% of the income decile pay the highest overall rate of tax, and the top 10% and the top 1% in particular pay the lowest overall rate of tax. But in between, we have broadly a flat tax, which Alvin Rabushka, who I once had the pleasure of meeting at the invitation of the IMF, we went around Eastern Europe talking about, well, why flat taxes should be delivered, and me why they were the devil's work. And by and large, I think I won. Yeah, unfortunately, when you add together the tax systems of many countries at present, they do tend to look a little bit flat. The UK certainly does, running at around 35% across most income levels right now. But what we need to do when we're selecting taxes is look at the overall package, and does it also raise the anticipated revenue, but in ways that have these social criterion attached. The important point here is, again, coming back to this point about economic efficiency. It's so commonplace to see people reference Adam Smith in this context, going right back to The Wealth of Nations. There's a copy somewhere up behind me, and his arguments about, you know, the efficiency of the tax being simple, easy to collect, understandable, least interference. Yeah, look, fine, but actually he was assuming that we had a gold standard, assuming that there was a shortage of money, not understanding the nature of money in the modern economy, not understanding of fiat currency and so on. Why on earth are we referencing that at this moment as if this is, the gold standard, literally, that they're trying to achieve? We have to move on from that. This said, and here I begin to explore this idea in a slightly different way, T is very definitely not a single figure within MMT. Tax is not a single figure. It is a much more complex figure than that. And let me just begin to explain that. And let me move on to look at this equation, which I think is what I want to explore. Tax is made up of a whole variety of taxes, which in turn are influenced by a whole variety of decisions taken both by a tax authority, but also, and this is quite important, by taxpayers as a consequence of the behaviors which they think are tolerated or not within the tax system and the state of tax compliance that exists within a country. That's the formula I'm going to explain. T equals TB times TR minus TP plus TAS plus TE plus TA plus TU. So let's talk about what that means, because this makes it a little easier. T in every case stands for tax, and I probably should have made the subscripts a little more obviously subscripts, but then they would just would have been harder to read on the screen, so I didn't. T is the total net tax collected. And very often people have simply dumped this into an MMT equation and said, that's tax. All I'm trying to explain here is that, well, that's just not true. That tax is obviously much more complicated than that, and we need to think about it in this more complicated way. So T is net total tax collected, but it's made up of, and first of all, we have that first set of brackets, which is the tax base for any particular tax. So we can estimate a tax base, and then we can multiply the value of that tax base by the tax rate. So to use an example, we could have actually, well, there's a simple example which is familiar in most countries, not so familiar in the US, I admit, but that's value-added tax, which is a sales tax. Yeah, and you have sales taxes, so you are familiar with this idea in broad terms. And the tax base is end consumption in the case of VAT within the economy. All intermediate stages are netted off inside, or almost all intermediate stages are netted off within the calculation of the tax base. And it is end consumption which forms the tax base for value-added tax. And value-added tax is a simple tax and actually does tend to have a standard tax rate in countries like the UK. We have a tax which is at 20% tax on end consumption. So you could say, once we know end consumption and we multiply by 20%, we know what the tax base is. You could say that, but we don't. And that is, of course, why I have the second set of brackets, the parts within there. So let me explore what the rest of that is. I mean, there are many tax bases. Just before I move on, though, tax bases, anything from wealth to financial transactions, which are not taxed in the UK very much, although they are a bit. They are officially taxed in some parts of the US, for example. I know that New York Stock Exchange has a transaction tax, but it hasn't been collected for a long time. We have other potential bases, for example, on environmental change, most of which are ignored as yet, and so on. So this brings me to the first of those other variables, which is TP. Now, this stands for tax policy losses, basically. The amount of money that is not collected as a result of the decision of a government to not tax a base. So, for example, wealth. Wealth is commonly not taxed in most countries around the world. It could be now. I think a decade ago, that would have been very hard to say. But frankly, we have shattered a great deal of tax haven opacity. I was heavily involved in that process, both at a corporate level. I created country by country reporting, which is what lets multinational corporations, or requires multinational corporations to report where they make their profits and where they pay their tax to a singular tax authority, their head office tax authority, who shares it with other tax authorities around the world. And we have automatic information exchange from most tax havens around the world. I was told in 2009 by the UK Treasury that this would not happen in my lifetime. And so I set out to try and achieve it. And it happened in 2017, and I'm still alive. So I'm very glad to say that the UK Treasury is an extremely bad forecaster. So we can now, as a result of being able to actually identify sources of tax, actually tax it if we wish to. And obviously you'll be familiar with Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman and others who are arguing that this is a viable basis for taxation. I'm not convinced by all their arguments, but nonetheless, I accept that we could if we wish to. It may not be the right way to go and tackle wealth, but it's possible. That's one of the decisions we make. The next one is in many ways more important, because TS stands for the tax spends that governments choose to make. And tax spends are the value of allowances, reliefs, and varying tax rates granted within tax bases. So a tax base can be taken out entirely by the TP variable, but once it's within the tax system, and sales are, for example, in the UK, then we have the value of allowances and reliefs and varying rates to consider. And these can make an enormous difference to the amount of the total potential base that is collected for a tax. Again, I'm going to use UK VAT because it's such a simple example in many ways to explain. And there are some significant exemptions from the charge to tax. Basically, everything is charged at 20% unless it isn't, and a lot of things aren't. Everything from funerals, glaringly obviously, to healthcare, I guess the two are considered to be related, to food, to education, so long as it's not for profit. Define what's for profit, of course, then becomes the interesting tax argument. But all these things don't have the tax charged on them, nor does new housing, and nor does a lot of other stuff, and nor do rents, and nor do financial services. As a result, 50% of the UK tax base for VAT disappears as a tax spend. It's gone. Now, given that we collect about 150 billion from VAT a year, that's a mighty lot of money we give away by putting in place these various spends and reliefs. In addition, some things like domestic fuel are charged at a rate lower than 20%. Actually, it's charged at 5%, subject to a lot of controversy at the moment, because obviously we have escalating fuel prices, as do you, and the argument is that that should be reduced. So understanding these things helps policy debate. But it also makes clear how significant the tax spends are. I think that TP and TS are very little discussed. In fact, they're almost not discussed in debate upon tax policy, but they're absolutely fundamental. And this is part of the reason why I want to expand the discussion around modern monetary theory, perhaps creating a modern taxation theory to almost parallel it. And Andrew Baker and I are considering writing that book, to explore how these issues interact with and should be worked at alongside the way the government spends to make sure there's an integration of policy and no spillover between the two. I might come back to spillovers. But we then have the conventional tax gaps, which are considered by the IMF and others. The tax evasion, illegal tax evasion, people not declaring that they are in possession of part of the tax base, tax avoidance, people using legislation in a way that was not intended by a government and as a result securing a tax advantage that no legislator intended they should have. Offshore frequently falls into that gap. And then there's tax unpaid, which is what the U in TU stands for. The taxpayer says the check's in the post to the IRS and the check never arrives. In the meantime, the taxpayer's done a runner, gone bust or whatever else. So those are the more easily appraised elements of the tax gap, despite which a lot of this is not undertaken. I'm currently working with the EU on their VAT gap, which is one of the reasons why I guess I'm talking about it, where I'm acting as a consultant to them to appraise this. And we're looking at extending it to that TP and TS level, because so far they've only looked at the evasion, avoidance and unpaid level. And clearly we need to go further. But my point is that we can reverse this calculation, therefore, into that identity for government spending. And therefore realize that when we're going to actually be controlling the macroeconomic equation, quite critically, our control of the tax system is pretty fundamental. If we want to make sure that we actually are the master of that economy, which MMT describes, we have to have a very high degree of tax compliance, which means controlling the tax gap is pretty darn critical. The tax gap being those 5 elements. So what's the relevance of this? Well, what I'm saying to you is that I think that we need to explore tax spends as well as tax revenues. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a demonstration of why that's significant in a moment. But we need to think about how we integrate tax policy into the overall idea of MMT. This is where this concept of spillover comes up. If you're not familiar with the concept of spillover, it exists in a tax environment. It was created by the IMF in a paper in 2014, where they tried to look at how one tax system, a tax haven, could undermine another tax system, for example, the UK. Unfortunately, they tried to do this using econometrics and for one tax only, corporation tax. And the data was in fact so noisy that it was exceptionally difficult to identify whether there was a spillover from tax havens to other economies, even though gut instinct tells us all there must be. Andrew Baker and I have created a framework for this appraisal of what part of a tax system supports or undermines another part of a tax system. And I happen to think that we could extend this further. I think that we can actually extend this idea of the tax revenues and the tax spends and the tax bases to integrate with the tax policy implications of the expenditure, which is what MMT is describing and how that should be or should not be balanced within the overall fiscal framework of a country. So to me, this seems to be incredibly important if we're going to appraise policy consequences. Just a little bit of data here. This is UK data because it's the country I am most familiar with. I do look at a lot of others, but this one is sort of fairly convenient. That is forecast data for the 21-22 tax year, the one that we're actually in right now in the UK. Where government expenditure is forecast to be about in total 50 billion more than government expenditure is 50 billion more than government revenue. And this is the revenue side. And the moment you look at that, you realize how diverse the net figure for T, because these are net figures after all those tax gaps. Let's be clear, there's nothing in here that says what the tax gaps are, how small some of these net figures are in comparison to the tax base. Now, let me just, I told you about VAT. 50% of VAT is lost due to policy decisions on tax spends. When we come to income tax, there's 198 billion collected, but 112 billion is given away in one particular tax relief, which is the basic personal allowance, the tax-free exemption of the first 12,500 of income in the UK each year. Another 60 billion of income tax is given away subsidizing pension and other saving fund contributions. In other words, these net figures are really not a good indication of the potential tax collection opportunity within an economy. and therefore do not properly inform policy debate. And that's really the point I'm trying to make here. You'll also see that some figures are surprisingly small. Corporation tax, the tax on corporate profits, is only 40 billion. We collect more than that in effectively land taxation over here, council tax and business rates, collect 50% more than that. National insurance contributions, effectively a payroll tax, are a significant contributor. Excise duties, charges on tobacco and alcohol, fundamentally, plus some carbon duties there, the sin taxation taxes, but not perhaps as big as you'd expect, because there are some surprising exemptions there too. Put these in the context of the spend, and you can see again how significant they are. Go back to that number I mentioned, 60 billion used to subsidize the savings of the wealthiest. Over half the subsidies on savings in the UK go to the top 10% of the wealth population. And so over 30 billion goes to them, and 60 billion is spent in all in subsidizing savings. And that's the equivalent of our defense budget. Now, you can argue whether we should have a bigger or smaller defense budget, but setting that against the fact that, we spend as much subsidizing savings, none of which are effectively put to any productive use, because they're either sitting dormant in bank accounts, which, as you and I know, is doing nothing for the productive economy, or are used for speculation in the stock exchange, which again, as I suspect you and I know, is doing very little for the creation of new wealth within the economy. It's a pretty amazing use of funds, but which isn't apparent from these charts, which is why I'm making this point that we have to actually understand this. Social protection, by the way, is simply old age pensions. A tiny part of that is unemployment benefits, but every single right-wing politician believes that's entirely unemployment benefits. It also, quite extraordinarily, includes the pensions of former civil servants. If ever there was a miscategorization of expenditure for political purpose, that was it. Personal social services is care facilities for vulnerable people, including the elderly who need care in their homes. Again, vastly less than we spend on subsidizing wealth. I've run through most of these numbers before by now, so I don't think I need to really think about them, but this is the tax spends analysis, and I've talked about those numbers. So where are we? Drawing to a close, so that I hope we've got plenty of time still left for discussion. That figure is not a single number. It is a complex number involving a significant number of decisions. And to be a complex policy solution, and that's what it has to be, MMT does, I think, have to embrace that fact and talk about how, as I say, this integrates into the overall fiscal management framework that MMT has to offer. By embracing the complexity that is involved in this. But it does not in any way change this fact that tax is not funding spending, but it is instead this withdrawal function. And we have to talk about the withdrawal function to control inflation, to also ratify the value of the currency, matching that up against the social policies in question. So that's pretty key. How do we do that? In particular, I just want to mention a couple of things here. In that bottom third of that slide, this requires that we do regular tax gap analysis. In the States, your tax gap analyses are decidedly occasional, sometimes once a decade. That clearly is insufficient to be able to understand and appraise the efficiency of the IRS, which we know is being or is suffering reduced funding and is doing many fewer audits, and is therefore highly likely to be less effective than it was. We need to do tax spillover analysis to identify weaknesses in the tax system, but I would suggest also, and beyond that, with regard to the macroeconomic framework as a whole. And we need these tax transparency frameworks where we actually look at the accounting of government. And I think accounting for government is an absolutely critical element of MMT in this sense, that we need to actually put the data face up on the table so that decision making is clear and accountable. Why? Well, again, I'd draw you down to the bottom half of this slide, because we want to be sure at the end of the day that the policy framework we're promoting does achieve the objectives that we set out for it. And therefore, I do think we need to know that tax is validating the currency in use, and that there aren't too many significant leakages, which therefore undermine the effectiveness of macroeconomic policy. We have to have an effective control framework. We have to control inflation. This could not be more relevant than now, where I think the Fed is just about getting every call it could make wrong, as is the Bank of England. We need to reduce inequality. We need to control market failure. We want to promote certain economic activities, particularly in the face of climate change. And I do believe we want to encourage voter participation in the democratic process. Now, that's what I think we need: a very clear transparency framework with regard to tax around MMT to deliver as well. Anyway, that's as far as I want to go. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and say I've done my bit, except for the questions and answers, and I hope there are a few.
Thank you. That was great. And you left a lot of time, and I see a lot of hands. So,
well, that was my hope.
Okay, let's see. Let's start.
Thank you very much. I was just curious if you feel that the contemporary sort of tax the rich movement has been effective in advancing these narratives, or sort of what the next frontier of making clear the role of taxes in MMT would look like to you in terms of like public awareness.
Oh, that's a great question. Patriotic Millionaires are an organization who I obviously am aware of and follow and have had a bit of interaction with. Let's be honest, we don't need, and I think we all know this, we don't need to tax the rich to be able to deliver an MMT economy. That's glaringly obviously true to us because we don't need tax to spend. And therefore, the patriotic millionaires idea that we are dependent upon them to be able to have the economy that we need is one which I, of course, don't wholly buy. The reason for taxing the rich is not because we need their money, it's because they're rich, of course, and they have very low marginal propensities to consume. And if we are to actually get a more balanced economy, we need to put money in the hands of those with high marginal propensities to consume who are in need. So the reason why we actually tax the rich is because we need to redistribute their income and wealth to those who actually require it. Do I actually think that there is a social function to that redistribution? And do I think that we should be doing that? Even though clearly we could actually give those people that money without it? Yes, I do. Why? Because as I've mentioned, I think during the course of what I've just done, but I'm very happy to elaborate, I think that there is an incredibly negative social function to saving at present. And that negative social function is that most savings that I can identify, obviously cash in bank accounts, and the money that is by and large saved in stock markets is effectively socially redundant money, as far as I can see. Most of it used for some form of speculation or simply nothing at all when placed in a bank account. I've just been brought a cup of tea. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. That will keep me going. That helps along no end. So there is a lot of education to do, is my answer to your question, because we do want to tax the wealthy because they are wealthy, because they disrupt the economy, because we have a massive misallocation of resources inside the US, the UK in particular, focused upon the financial services industry, which does not add net value, in my opinion, to the economy, and which does suck enormous amounts of tax subsidy, both in terms of reduced rates and direct subsidy for pensions and so on, but which, 401ks, etc. If I get the terminology right, I think I do. Is it 401k, the US pension fund?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought it was. So, yeah, all attracting subsidies, which are frankly pretty inappropriate, and which could be applied better to reallocating a genuine capital resource, which I think savings are, to productive process, which neoliberal financial capitalism has entirely forgotten how to do. It's as if capital doesn't exist inside neoliberalism anymore. And I think there is a big task to think about there and how we use, I mean, for example, in the UK economy, that 60 billion of subsidies to redirect money towards the Green New Deal, where it would be useful as instead of where it is now. But certainly the patriotic millionaires message is wrong. in the sense that we don't need them to be able to achieve change, but we do need to change the tax system to address inequality.
Thank you. My question is sort of, I see MMT as viewing taxes largely at, as counter-cyclical, and same with spending. Sort of, it is a policy variable, the parameters with which, around which that we use to tax and spend, but the actual amount of spending in a given year and the amount of tax revenue in a given year in dollar terms is not something that is directly set by policy. Does that fit in with your framework, and how does your framework account for that? Does that question make sense?
I think that's a political judgment. It's not a political judgment I think I probably share. I think I do, with regard to tax, share that logic. I don't think I share that logic with regard to spend. I think most government spends are actually pretty darned essential, certainly in the UK. And I've been around for long enough to have seen many politicians over many years, and to have met a great many of them, if I'm totally honest, since the 1970s. I knew most of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet in the early 70s for some bizarre reason. I met most of them when I was at university. And they keep on saying that they will find that there's spending they don't need, and they can cut this and it's a variable. I don't actually think most government spend is a variable. It is in the sense that it's counter-cyclical because unemployment can go up and down, yes, but most of it is actually pretty darned essential. In the UK, there is virtually no significant alternative to state education for most people. There is no real alternative for most medical situations to our National Health Service, which is still free at the point of delivery. It is pretty much vanity to go elsewhere. And I say that without much political evidence, but bias, because a lot of the things done on the NHS, outside the NHS, are frankly vanity medication. So depending upon the structure of the economy, I think a lot of spend is not particularly pro or anti-cyclical. So tax is the compensatory mechanism in this case to compensate for overheating and shortage of demand inside the private sector economy, given that I think that the state sector economy and spend underpins the basic supporting of society. So I agree with you on half of your suggestion, and that is that tax should very definitely be a pro-cyclical variable, and so yes, T in that sense, the total is estimated as a whole, although that doesn't deny obviously that there are social functions within it as well. But on the spend side, no, I don't tend to agree with you.
Hello, thank you. My question is something in your presentation. You were talking about how certain taxes are used to reallocate resources or move things around. I think that's what I got. But through the MMT lens, taxes are just money that's extinguished. It's an obligation that's extinguished upon receipt by the government. So you're not really moving any money around for another purpose. Wouldn't it be more accurate to say that taxes merely shift behavior, push it in certain ways? You don't want to be taxed for X behavior, so you go and do Y behavior instead. Something like, I've heard Professor Ray say the whole point of a carbon tax is to never collect any money on the carbon tax.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure that out.
Oh, look, I would agree with that. I mean, I'd said the same of a financial transaction tax. I mean, the best financial transaction tax on speculative financial transactions would never collect a penny, a cent, a yen, or whatever else of revenue. We get rid of the unproductive speculation. And I'd agree on a carbon tax. The best carbon tax would never collect money. But the reality is that we do have those behaviors. Now, so let's just put this in the context of what we call the withdrawal function. Because that is what tax is. We are withdrawing money from circulation. So I agree with you entirely. That is the MMT perspective. But where we choose to make that withdrawal clearly has a behavioral consequence. And that is all I'm saying in that sense. So I'm not saying the tax is necessarily better or worse. I'm not disputing that MMT does withdraw money from circulation and cancels it. That's exactly what it does. But where we decide to withdraw money from the economy does have a significant potential impact upon the way people spend. And let me give you an indication of how powerful tax reliefs, allowances, and so on are. In the second of the papers that I refer to, that I put on the list, the one about tax and social policy, we looked at the distribution of wealth and the ways in which it is invested in the UK. And right now there's 15.2 trillion of financial wealth in the UK. And you can cut that in various ways. You can include property, you can exclude property. If you exclude property, the numbers go below 10 trillion. But however you look at it and however you slice it, you end up with about 80+% of wealth being or in assets which are tax incentivized. So pension funds, what's something we have called an individual saving account, or property, which is heavily tax incentivized in the UK, and so on. These things have massive tax incentives attached to them. I don't think that's a coincidence that so much money is in tax incentivized savings vehicles, which is what we're talking about, because obviously the pension fund then goes on to invest in something else. And so does the individual saving account, even if it's cash. So the tax element of the structuring of our society has significant behavioral consequences. If we want to change behavior in our society, we can therefore change the way in which we do or don't withdraw funds from the economy. And I think that is what I'm saying. I'm not denying that it is, at the end of the day, simply a withdrawal of cash. It is. But we can choose on where and how and on what we will withdraw that money. And that will have a behavioral consequence. Does that answer your question?
Almost. I got a lot to think about, but thank you.
We've got another session later on.
So do you think taxes could help with the current inflation we're seeing? If so, what taxes? And if not, what should we be doing?
Yes, I do. I think that tax could have an enormous impact upon the current inflation that we're seeing. The difficulty is that we do not, and you most certainly in the US do not have any taxes that are particularly suitable to undertake that task, because you don't have a VAT. The great advantage of value-added tax is that actually you can change it with about 15 minutes notice. It's rather like excise duties. There's a habit of UK Chancellors of the Exchequer to stand up and announce their budgets, and they will say that as of 6 p.m. this evening, excise duties will change by 10 pence per pint of beer and 15 pence per gallon of petrol or whatever else. And they believe that the world will react that quickly. I suspect there's a bit more of a lag than they think there is, but that's what they believe. And value-added tax is a tax that you can change again at remarkably short notice. And of course, it's a tax on consumption. So if you are seeking to reduce consumption and you do believe that we have a demand pull inflation at the moment, and I don't, by the way, we have a supply side crisis at the moment, we don't have a demand pull inflation at all. But if you do believe that, then tax clearly has a significant element of control of inflation. We have a massive problem with the current mechanisms for controlling inflation, in particular the Fed's use of interest rate rises in the UK, the Bank of England's increase in bank base rate. So, for example, one of the big problems we have in the UK, which I suspect is replicated in the States, and I'm very keen for someone to tell me if that's true. With something called the New Economics Foundation, we've been putting out some material in the last week or so, explaining that, in fact, that because base money in the UK, the central bank reserve accounts have been increased by quantitative easing to 895 billion. And the Bank of England has since 2008 paid bank base rate on those balances. We could, over the next 3 or 4 years, be paying out 57 billion to the commercial banks in the UK for interest on deposit accounts, which are effectively created by the government, gifted to them as a consequence of quantitative easing. Massively foreshortening the redemption profile of UK Treasury bonds and increasing the cost of government borrowing, which is quite ludicrous. So the existing structures don't work. What could we do with tax to do something better? It's a tax that has been only tried a couple of times in the world, I would suggest, and it is actually a financial transaction tax, and it's on the financial flows through bank accounts. It was used in Brazil highly effectively at a rate of 0.38% on all financial flows through bank accounts. I think it was a flat tax, and it funded effectively a form of a national health service. It was so successful that the right-wing opponents of this national health service actually got into power and removed the tax so that there would have to be a private health service again. And Australia tried a variant as well. The taxes are, I would use them, and for those who are familiar with financial transaction tax, you could actually have what could be called the Spahn variety, where if you have a financial crisis, you have prices moving out of control, you could increase the rate of tax to reduce demand temporarily, to therefore suppress demand, to therefore bring prices back under control again. Now, if you believe that is the inflation problem you are facing, then this is a tax could solve that problem. It would deal with a demand supply side inflationary issue. The reality is that we have a supply side inflationary issue created by incoherent planning for COVID reopening, particularly in Europe. I don't know quite that's true in the States. I think you probably did it better than we did at that level. And you've certainly managed employment figures probably better than we did. You clearly have profiteering as a result of supply chain mismanagement in that period. And then you have war and sanctions and consequent food supplies and so on. All of these to me are supply side issues. And I don't think that they require the type of reaction that we're getting like federal interest rates. And I don't think they would actually particularly require a tax involvement. Here, I'm very much with Professor Danny Blanchflower, who is at Dartmouth, your side of the pond, but actually a Scot. And he and I work together quite a bit. We call ourselves the Mile End Road economists. The Mile End Road is the road out of the City of London towards the East End, which is traditionally exceptionally poor and the first landing point of immigrants in London when they arrived at the docks. It's exactly a mile, hence the name, from the Bank of England, and presents a very different worldview. We think that actually this inflation is temporary, cyclical, and will go away of its own accord anyway. We believe that you don't need to actually be increasing interest rates, and I wouldn't be personally putting any form of tax to increase effectively the price of goods and services at the moment. But if I needed to, and there are occasions when you would, then I think that there is a tax we need to design to provide MMT with the inflationary tool or the anti-inflationary tool it requires through taxation to be able to say, yeah, we've got an alternative to interest rate policy and knocking monetary policy out of the court as a result. Sorry if that was a little long in as an answer, but this is a pretty big current topical issue, of course.
Hi, Richard. Okay, so taxation is, of course, necessary for forcing people to use the government's money to move resources from the private to the public sector, and several other reasons. You know, there's no way around that. So there are critical uses to taxation, but I also see some popular desires for taxation as essentially reactive, where, like, yeah, we should have a wealth tax, but the bigger problem is that we really shouldn't allow them to get that rich in the first place. So pre-distribution versus redistribution.
Yes.
And so, you know, being more proactive and preventative. So can you discuss, basically, can you discuss when taxation is truly necessary and when we should just not have given those people that money in the first place?
I guess I'm a pragmatist. There is a very popular story which is told by Irish people about Ireland. So I can tell it because I have an Irish passport, and with a name like mine, that's not surprising. And that is when the tourist asks how to get to somewhere in Ireland, the local says, well, I wouldn't start from here. Except, of course, that's where you are. And, you know, the reality is that we have got a dire distribution of wealth and a dire distribution of income. And, you know, I can't assume that away. And I'm not willing to assume that away. So whilst I would agree with you that obviously we need to actually take steps to address those issues in non-taxation fashion, I mean, we need an incomes policy. Why wouldn't we have an incomes policy? Why wouldn't we have a system of discussing the imposition of high tax, high pay rates. I mean, in the UK, we have a minimum wage. Why can't we have a maximum wage? Why can't the maximum wage be 10 times the living wage in the UK? It would be entirely possible. You could live on 10 times the living wage in the UK, I think, like a lord, to use something which I would actually abolish in this country if only I had the right. And I was offered a peerage once. Certainly discussed it. I didn't want it. Look, there is a problem with your assumption that we can actually solve the problem in only one way. I don't think we can. I have a fly who's just walked over, because it's so hot, we have flies out and I've got the windows open, walked over the, literally the camera. I think we need both tools. It's a simple fact. And I guess this comes back to what I was saying, that I don't see that there's an MMT solution. I don't see there's a tax solution. I think we have to think about how can we put the two together to achieve an overall policy outcome with the greatest potential speed to reach, I mean, not equilibrium, because I don't believe in equilibrium, but the best position that we can reach. And that's why I think we need to do that integration. Tax has a role to play in the policy adjustment, some of which will be literally a mechanism for the creation of past mistakes. And some of it could also be a way of implementing a social policy. For example, I did write a paper about a decade ago for the Trade Union Congress in the UK, which did propose a maximum wage. We actually couldn't work out how we could definitely legislate a maximum wage, if truth be told, because we realized that companies would then simply issue some form of equity, share, bond or whatever else to a manager and pay them a return on that instead of giving them a wage. So there would be an abuse that would probably go on around it. But what we could do, and this was the way we solved the problem, was say, well, we can certainly provide a maximum amount of wage on which we will give a corporate tax deduction. So 10 times the living wage is the maximum amount that you may have tax relief on if you choose to pay your chief executive £4 million a year. And the maximum deduction that we're going to permit is around $250,000. The rest, well, you bear the cost. There is no tax relief. So the cost of paying that has effectively gone up by adding an additional payroll tax. So it is a pragmatic tool to help the delivery of policy. I do not think there is an optimal outcome to almost any of these answers in the lifetime of probably anyone sitting in the room right now. Sorry to say that.
Hi, Richard. I'm actually directing my remarks to our audience here because I have a copy of The Joy of Tax, the book that Richard was mentioning. It was not published in the United States, so you have to order it from the UK, but Amazon will find it for you. I've used it in several courses. It's written at the same level of accessibility as the deficit myth, and it really goes into these issues deeply. And I think you will particularly enjoy his 40-page rant at the end of the book, in which he imagines himself as Chancellor of the Exchequer. So read The Joy of Tax. Now, Richard will say that he's got a better book coming out sometime soon, and I don't doubt that, but this is the book that's available now. Check it out.
Can I tell you a little story about that rant? I agree with my publisher. I was going to actually write this last chapter, which was going to pull all the policy ideas together to demonstrate that they could be delivered politically. And then I thought, how long is a chancellor's speech? And I downloaded a speech that George Osborne, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made to the UK House of Commons to support a budget in July 2015. And if I remember rightly, and I'm a sad sort of git for numbers because I'm a chartered accountant, I think it was 9,410 words. So I sat down and wrote the final chapter, which is a rant, and I wrote 9,410 words in a day. That chapter was literally written in a day. And it sounds like it's a speech because I talked it into the machine. That's the way you can write 9,410 words in a day. But of course, then I submitted it to the editor, and they edited it. So it wasn't 9,410 words. So my joke with myself, I'm afraid, failed. But I actually was sad enough to actually write an exact length speech. But it was there deliberately, because I make the point, I create ideas because I'm interested in their policy translation. Everything I've ever done is about the idea of moving from, you know, a pretty theoretical idea very often. You know, I mentioned country by country reporting, the idea I created to tackle multinational corporation tax abuse. It's a pretty theoretical piece of accounting at one level. The whole point was that I was trying to turn it into a practical policy that could be used by tax authorities around the world. And it worked because I came up with the minimum number of variables necessary to achieve the result, which was just 7 variables, and argued that right the way through the OECD and got it. And again, here I'm pragmatic. I'm interested in what is the minimum level that we need to change with regard to thinking around tax and MMT so that we can persuade people to actually use it. We know there's going to be a benefit if they will. How can we actually put into place those measures that will help them understand enough of this stuff to put it into place so that they can use it for the benefit of society, which I believe it can deliver.
So I have a question about the investment side of sort of growing the output that we in sectors where we want to grow. So I was wondering, you've talked a bunch about trying to shift wealth from those who have it to those who would have a higher marginal propensity to consume, which then, you know, according to Keynesian logic, would stimulate investment, would stimulate output growth. And then if you can, we've also talked a little bit about, you know, influencing consumption behavior such that then the investment goes into sectors that are desirable in terms of growth, like renewable energy, etc. I was wondering a little if you could talk a little bit more about the supply side and how to incentivize investment more directly. Obviously, we have some government expenditure that might be public investment that would help to leverage in private investment again. Could you talk a little bit more, because you've brushed over, you know, the problem of asset price inflation. We also, like, I'm a bit concerned about stranded assets. So we have investments currently with stocks of money that is in assets that should not be used for productive activities anymore. How can we think about sort of like shrinking assets that are undesirable, that we don't want to be liquidated in the future, to make demands on you know, real resources? And how can we think about incentivizing investment from the private sector into things that are desirable, and what role does tax policy play in that? Thanks.
Oh, thank you. This is really an area which I'm doing a great deal of thinking about. This is actually the next book, by the way. The book is called How Are You Going to Pay for It?, which is the question that every journalist in the UK asks of every politician whenever they put up a good idea or what they think is a good idea. How are you going to pay for it? And my answer is that actually at the moment we have these massive tax subsidies to savings, which are completely wasted. Money in bank accounts is redundant money. No bank needs there to be money in a bank account to lend. We know that. Most people don't. Most people still think that a bank is an intermediary. It, of course, isn't. And as I couldn't see the question, by the way, because you're off screen as far as I'm concerned, so I'm sorry about that. But the issue that I have is that, again, the research I've been doing on something called hollowed out firms, if you search Google for something called hollowed out firms, I've been doing this research at Sheffield with some colleagues about, and you'll be familiar with this in the States, you know, patterns of share repurchasing, patterns of dividend distribution, how they're abusing rules on accounting, and they definitely are, to over distribute profits, which they've artificially generated, to actually basically pay out dividends in excess of earnings. 30% or more of UK top 100 companies pay out over the last decade more in dividends than they have generated in earnings, which is a pretty staggering achievement, and dividends and share buybacks. And so therefore they are not using their own reserves to create money, and they're not issuing new shares, they're buying back. So there is no net capital market, is the point that I am making. And yet people insist on saving. Now, at a microeconomic level, I have a complete understanding of why people save. You know, I'm 64. I have been self-employed for more of my life than I have been employed. I've had to provide for my own pension fund. Of course, I've saved. And one day I might retire, although right now I'm nominating 83 as the date when I'm going to consider it. So I've still got nearly 20 years to go. But it'll happen. And that's a perfectly good microeconomic decision, but macroeconomically it's dysfunctional because my savings are really not very useful. So how do we change the tax incentives for saving is my question, and actually therefore reallocate. And I'm going to use one example, which is a very simple savings account we have in the UK. It's called an ISA, individual savings account. Anybody can put in up to 20,000 a year. The saving is then income tax free, capital gains tax free, and you have to hold it in there for a couple of years. And then after that, all the earnings are tax free. People have been doing this for years. We now have ISA millionaires. Over half the money is held in cash. There's 700 billion pounds in this account. That is 5% of total UK financial wealth, total UK wealth. It is 8% of total UK financial wealth, completely irrelevant, and it's costing us several billion a year to subsidize it. My suggestion is very simple. You change the terms of conditions of that account. Incredibly popular accounts, very simple. And instead you say you will put your money into a Green New Deal bond issued by the government. Now, the government doesn't need money, you say, but this is actually deliberately capital to go through not a central bank, but an investment bank. And it is provided as capital to projects. And the reason why you do that and not put it through the central bank and not put it through straightforward government expenditure is you then release government expenditure to be for revenue purposes, because it is argued that we are at the limit by the political opponents. They argue that we are at the limit of what the government can tax. Therefore, I want to actually break the revenue capital cycle here. Look, I understand that we aren't at the limit of what we can tax, but I'm dealing with the political reality that that's the argument we have to win. And therefore I say, let's use this as capital. So if we're going to have a subsidy from the state to savings, which is a microeconomic function, which we're not going to stop, we need to use it for a macroeconomic purpose, which is to actually make sure that this capital is productively used. Every single major transformation in society in the past has involved a shift between the labor capital reward and the better use of capital to enhance the overall level of well-being within society. Right now, we've reached the point where capital is performing almost no useful function in society. It's my argument, therefore we need to change it, and tax can incentivize that change. That's fundamentally the argument of the next book. Is it MMT consistent? In a sense, no. I mean, and I'm very happy to say, look, there's elements in here which if I was living in a pure MMT world, I wouldn't be saying. But I'm not living in a pure MMT world. I'm having to deal with those, dunderheads, and that's the politest term I think I can probably use, of politicians in the UK, and you've got a fair number of them as well in the States, who simply refuse to accept any of this stuff. And I've therefore got to come up with a better argument as to how I can use capital than they can, whilst actually letting the revenue cycle run as I would wish, using an MMT logic and using tax within that cycle. So I'm just trying to change the incentives to try and overall improve the level of direction of assets into the biggest crisis we face, which is climate change. I mean, as I said, I co-authored the Green New Deal, the one that you've got in the States, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez lifted from the UK. Well, I was one of the 8 authors of that back in 2008. So what you have is, something I've helped create, but we need to actually change the environment of thinking around it. And the way I work is, and this is why I'm integrating tax thinking into my thinking about macroeconomic frameworks, is how can I achieve that change? And I'm totally pragmatic. I mean, all the time I think about the theoretical elements and I understand the theoretical elements, and then I ask, how far can I compromise to achieve the outcome that I want? And I'm afraid to say, I think that's the way we have to be to get the change we want. Sorry about that.
Thanks a lot. On that note, we'll close this one and see you in a few hours.